The morning of June 6th, 1944, dawned grey and restless over the Normandy coastline. Mist clung to the cliffs like a shroud, and the waves lapped with a deceptive gentleness, hiding the thousands of steel-plated men and vehicles waiting offshore. Among them, Lieutenant Colonel Edward Carrington stood on the deck of the USS Samuel Chase, peering through binoculars at the jagged silhouette of Omaha Beach. He was 42, with hands calloused from years of administrative command, yet this day demanded more than logistics or planning. It demanded the orchestration of a miracle. The operation he had helped plan for months was about to unfold. The landing of the largest supply armada in history, intended to land 5 million tons of equipment, rations, fuel, and ammunition in 72 hours. The Germans believed the Allies could never achieve such a feat, and Carrington, watching the sun rise over the churning channel, quietly wondered if they were wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The beaches, still smeared with the remnants of morning fog, were already alive with activity. Landing craft nosed through the surf, disgorging trucks, jeeps, Sherman tanks, and endless columns of soldiers. Soldiers shouted over the din, coordinating the unloading of rations, artillery shells, and barrels of fuel. The smell of salt, oil, and cordite mingled in the air, and the shouts of the men on the beach rose above the roar of engines. Every man knew that the tide of war rested not on the bullets they fired, but on the supplies that reached the front in time. Carrington's gaze moved along the line of cargo ships. Each one represented months of industrial planning and production, thousands of hours of dockside labor, and the careful orchestration of men who had never fired a rifle, yet were indispensable to victory. They called them the Supply Army, though they bore no arms. Their battlefield was asphalt and sand, warehouses and quays, and they were about to test the limits of human endurance. In the heart of this mechanical surge, Carrington saw the first Red Ball trucks rolling off the landing craft, engines roaring, headlights cutting through the early fog. He knew that every second counted, every delay would be a victory, ceded to the German defenders who still clung stubbornly to their positions inland. Meanwhile, just across the French countryside, General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, freshly returned from inspecting the Atlantic Wall, had a rare moment of apprehension. He had spent the previous night reviewing intelligence reports, calculating the speed at which American and British forces could move once they broke through the beaches, and assessing how long it would take to halt them. His staff briefed him. 5 million tons of material were scheduled to arrive in 72 hours. The scale of the operation was incomprehensible. He had imagined supply lines stretching like fragile threads, vulnerable to ambush, to bad weather, to the miscalculations of men in green uniforms who had never fought in the mud and snow of the Russian steppes. He had prepared for an invasion, but nothing in German military history had accounted for this kind of industrial precision unleashed across an entire coast. The sheer audacity of it froze him, if only for a moment. Back on the beaches, Sergeant James Rucard was struggling to control a loaded 2.5-ton GMC truck as it bumped down a hastily repaired causeway. He was 19, black, and had been drafted from Cleveland less than a year earlier. He had trained in Georgia, shipped to England, and now, in the first week of the Normandy landings, found himself navigating through chaos that seemed designed to test the limits of human endurance. His truck carried 30 barrels of gasoline, destined for a forward depot just 20 miles inland. Each barrel represented a lifeline for a tank crew, an infantry company, or an artillery battery. If they did not arrive on time, men would die, positions would be lost, and months of planning would unravel. The convoy rumbled along, headlights dimmed to avoid drawing attention from German aircraft that occasionally strafed the roads. Rucard had learned to navigate by memory. Every curve, every pothole, every dangerous intersection was etched into his mind. The French countryside blurred past, punctuated by the occasional shell crater, a burned-out vehicle, or a cow startled by the passing trucks. Sleep had become a luxury, He had survived on 2 or 3 hour intervals of rest, curled up on the hard metal bed of his truck, waking to the constant vibration of the engine and the distant sound of artillery. For the German soldiers defending inland, the morning brought a grim realization. Every calculation, every assumption about American supply limitations had been shattered. Ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements arrived with a speed and efficiency that seemed almost supernatural. German officers, some of whom had been seasoned veterans of France, Poland, and Russia, exchanged anxious glances. A lieutenant in the First Army noted in his diary that the sheer volume of supplies arriving made the Allied advance seem less human and more inevitable. A relentless tide that no tactical maneuver could stem. The Red Ball Express had become a symbol of this inexorable momentum, though it had only begun its operations days earlier. As Rocard navigated through the final mile toward the forward depot, the psychological weight of the operation pressed upon him. He carried no weapon capable of turning the tide of a battle. His influence lay solely in his ability to deliver. But in that moment, he understood the strange, almost paradoxical power of logistics. Armies did not live on courage alone. They lived on fuel, ammunition, rations, and the persistence of men willing to move them through danger. Each drop of gasoline in his barrels, each crate of ammunition stacked in the depot, represented a battle that might be fought successfully. Each mile he covered kept the advance alive. By noon, the unloading of ships had reached a rhythm that was almost mechanical. Dock workers, soldiers, and drivers moved in a precise choreography honed over months of rehearsal. Gasoline barrels, ammunition crates, medical supplies, and rations were funneled onto trucks, trains, and jeeps, moving inland along carefully designated routes. General Eisenhower himself had emphasized the importance of this supply operation in the planning meetings before D-Day. He understood that success would not be measured solely by how many men made it to the beaches, but by how quickly and efficiently those men could be resupplied. Without this logistical backbone, even the most brilliant assault would falter. Across the countryside, the German infantry struggled to reconcile the reality in front of them with the expectations instilled by years of indoctrination. They had been taught to believe that Allied supply lines would inevitably collapse under the strain of rapid movement, that lack of vehicles, fuel, or competent drivers would slow the invaders and provide a window for counterattack. Now, evidence contradicted every assumption. Fuel and ammunition arrived faster than they could intercept it. American trucks moved with a speed that defied comprehension. Tanks that should have stalled for lack of gasoline pressed forward, supported by an endless stream of rolling supply. German generals, accustomed to planning around scarcity, were confronted by a new paradigm: abundance. The psychological effect was profound. Colonel Friedrich von Hohenberg, a logistics officer with the 15th Army, later recounted that morning as one of disorientation. He had expected to encounter gaps, delays, and attrition in the supply columns. Instead, he witnessed the seemingly impossible, a continuous, unstoppable flow of material. It was as though the sea itself carried them, he wrote, and we stood helpless on the shore. His words reflected a broader truth across the German command. The Allies had achieved a level of operational flexibility that was entirely foreign to their doctrine. The advance of the armies was no longer limited by the battlefield. It was enabled by the trucks, the drivers, and the organizational genius behind the supply lines. On the American side, every truck represented not only a piece of machinery, but a story of determination. James Rocard, for instance, had grown up in a segregated America, where black men were often dismissed as unfit for combat. Yet here he was, driving through danger, fatigue gnawing at his body, delivering supplies that determined the fate of thousands. He had come to understand the strange heroism of logistics, the bravery required to persist in a task that had no immediate glory, no medal, no recognition beyond the knowledge that failure would have catastrophic consequences. Each mile was a quiet act of defiance against the chaos of war, each delivery a confirmation of competence in a world that had underestimated him. By late afternoon, the initial wave of 5 million tons of supplies was halfway ashore. Dock workers, soldiers, and drivers had moved with a speed and precision that defied expectations. The Americans had anticipated delays, yet the operation proceeded almost seamlessly. Ammunition flowed to artillery units, fuel to tanks, medical supplies to field hospitals. Each delivery was recorded meticulously. Mistakes could mean death. Yet the human machinery of the operation functioned with an efficiency that would have seemed impossible to the German high command. Meanwhile, Rommel's anxieties deepened. Reports from the front lines indicated that the Allied forces were not merely surviving on minimal supplies, they were advancing, supported, and almost impossible to halt. He observed that American forces could sustain offensives that German logistics, reliant on constrained railheads and horse-drawn wagons, could never match. The contrast was stark. Whereas German divisions had spent months learning to operate within strict logistical limits, the Americans were reshaping the concept of what supply lines could achieve. As evening fell, Rukard returned from a grueling run to fetch another load of gasoline. The truck's engine hummed, tired but unbroken. He glanced west toward the beaches, where landing craft still disgorged vehicles and soldiers, their outlines blurred by the evening mist. He felt a deep, almost spiritual satisfaction. Every delivery kept the momentum of the advance. Every mile driven was a small victory, every barrel of gasoline a lifeline. Yet he was also acutely aware of the fragility underlying the operation. If any link in this chain failed, roads washed out by rain, bridges destroyed by shell fire, trucks breaking down beyond repair, the entire advance could stall. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Across the lines, German soldiers watched with increasing disbelief. Supply columns moved faster than their reconnaissance could track, and forward positions received ammunition and reinforcements at a rate that defied logic. Rumors spread among the troops. 5 million tons of supplies had landed in 72 hours. For men trained to expect scarcity, this was incomprehensible. The psychological weight of the operation matched its material impact. The enemy could no longer calculate American limitations, and that uncertainty alone shifted the balance of power. By nightfall, Normandy was alive with movement, the glow of headlights illuminating the twisted shapes of tanks, trucks, and landing craft. Soldiers huddled in foxholes and behind makeshift barricades, listening to the roar of engines and the distant echo of artillery. Above it all, the Allies had achieved what Rommel and other German generals had thought impossible. They had landed 5 million tons of supplies in 3 days, creating a logistical momentum that could not be halted by conventional measures. Rukard parked his truck near the forward depot, his body exhausted, his mind alert. The Red Ball Express had become a lifeline for the advancing forces, but its success rested on thousands of men like him. Drivers, mechanics, dock workers who labored in the shadow of combat without recognition. Yet in that anonymity lay their power. While tanks and guns took the headlines, it was the quiet perseverance of these men that determined the pace of victory. They had transformed the abstract calculations of military planners into reality, proving that logistics was not merely support, but combat in its own right. The night brought no rest. Normandy's fields were alive with the low rumble of engines, punctuated by distant artillery that rolled across the countryside like distant thunder. James Rukard and the other drivers of the Red Ball Express huddled in whatever shelter they could find, wrecked barns, shallow ditches, and the hollowed-out remains of bombed-out houses. Yet the rest was fitful at best. Sleep came in short bursts, fragmented by the worry of breakdowns, ambushes, and the ever-present German patrols. Even here, in the dimly lit French countryside, The war could reach out and snatch a man in an instant. By dawn, Rucard was awake again, climbing into the cab of his GMC truck. The fuel barrels he carried were no longer just numbers or logistics. They were lifelines for tank crews pushing deeper into enemy territory, for infantry units that had advanced faster than anyone anticipated. Each delivery was a promise that the men in front would have the tools to fight, that the operation would not stall. He gripped the steering wheel, feeling the vibrations through his palms, listening to the engine hum as if it were a heartbeat echoing through his body. In this strange theater, machines were allies, and every mile he drove was a tactical move as critical as any skirmish fought with rifle or cannon. In the German command posts, Rommel's unease had metastasized into urgency. Reports indicated that the Americans had established forward supply points further inland than anyone in the Wehrmacht had anticipated. His officers argued that counterattacks might be feasible, but Rommel knew the limitations of his own logistics. Fuel shortages, disrupted railways, and the scattered disposition of forces meant that any counterattack would be piecemeal, slow, and vulnerable. He could not believe the sheer audacity of the Red Ball Express, the relentless flow of trucks and supplies that defied attrition and ambush alike. The operational reality had outstripped theory. What had been a battle of men and guns was now a war of movement, speed, and industrial capacity. Meanwhile, in a ruined French village, Corporal Heinrich Fischer, a German truck driver drafted into logistics support, watched with growing frustration. He had been trained to expect that Allied advances would grind to a halt once fuel and ammunition ran out. Yet, the Americans moved with mechanical precision, their columns stretching over miles of road, trucks glinting in the dawn light, their drivers skilled and fearless. Fischer's own convoys had been harried by ambushes and partisan activity, yet they never matched the scale or speed of the American operation. He wrote in his journal that night, "They move as if the world itself bends to carry them." There was awe in his words, tinged with fear. Admiration and dread are strange companions in war. By mid-morning, the logistical ballet intensified. Supply depots swelled with fuel, food, and ammunition, each barrel and crate marked, organized, and directed to precise points on the front lines. The Americans had anticipated bottlenecks, road damage, mechanical failures, enemy interference, but contingency plans worked like clockwork. Mechanics followed behind the convoys, repairing vehicles almost before they broke, ensuring that the flow never faltered. Communication lines buzzed with updates, reroutes, and coordination, all synchronized to maintain momentum. It was a system that seemed almost alive, a network of human and mechanical resilience pushing relentlessly forward. Rucard's next assignment took him through a stretch of road that had been pounded by enemy artillery overnight. Craters yawned in the asphalt, and the remains of destroyed vehicles littered the shoulders. Smoke still curled from abandoned tanks, and the stench of oil and burnt rubber hung in the air. He navigated carefully, yet the truck lurched violently as the tires struck a hidden crater. He felt his stomach lurch, a jolt of panic tempered by training and experience. The cargo was intact. He pressed on, every mile an act of defiance against the chaos that sought to stop him. In a forward artillery position, Lieutenant Thomas Harding watched as fuel arrived, allowing tanks to continue their advance into the German lines. His men cheered quietly, not for themselves, but for the miracle that these trucks represented. Harding had been on the front for weeks, had seen supply shortages grind operations to a halt, and had lost friends to the simple absence of fuel or ammunition. Now, with every barrel that arrived, the morale of his unit soared. They could fight, push forward, and hold positions without the gnawing fear of running out of what they needed most. Logistics had become not just the backbone of strategy, but the lifeblood of survival. Rommel, informed of the relentless pace, ordered reconnaissance patrols to identify potential weak points in the supply lines. Night ambushes were planned, bridges were mined, and infantry units positioned themselves to intercept the endless stream of trucks. Yet, for every disruption attempted, the Americans adapted. Alternate routes were opened, convoys rerouted, and trucks repaired faster than they could be destroyed. By mid-afternoon, the German planners recognized a terrifying truth. The Red Ball Express was not a mere supply line. It was an unstoppable operational force. In one particularly harrowing run, Rukard found himself navigating through a wooded section of road under intermittent shell fire. The explosions shook the ground, flung dirt and debris into the air, and threatened to overturn the truck. He pressed forward, adrenaline sharpening his senses, calculating every curve, every potential hazard. When he emerged from the woods, he found a bridge, partially destroyed, its planks smoldering. He had no choice but to stop. Radioing for assistance, he waited with the engine running, every nerve alert, aware that German reconnaissance could be near. Minutes stretched into hours, yet he refused to abandon the cargo. The barrels of fuel were irreplaceable, and the lives of soldiers further down the line depended on him. Back in Berlin, Hitler and his staff were growing increasingly frustrated. Reports of the Red Ball Express, of 5 million tons of supplies moving inland with surgical precision, contradicted everything they had predicted. The Führer, accustomed to commanding campaigns that relied on attrition and positional warfare, could not comprehend how an army could maintain such speed and efficiency under fire. Advisors suggested targeted attacks on key supply depots, but the Americans had dispersed their logistical network so effectively that striking one point had little effect. The concept of the line had shifted. The battlefield was no longer confined to the front. It extended to every road, every convoy, and every truck, delivering fuel and ammunition without pause. In Normandy, as dusk fell, Rukard completed another run, the tires of his GMC coated in mud and grime. He pulled into the depot, exhausted but unbroken, his cargo intact. The warehouse commander met him with a nod of respect. No words were necessary. The men around him moved silently, carrying crates and barrels to their designated positions. The work was relentless, continuous, almost ritualistic, yet imbued with a sense of purpose that transcended exhaustion. In these moments, the drivers, mechanics, and dock workers understood something that the generals in distant headquarters often overlooked. War was not only fought with bullets, but with endurance, precision, and the unwavering will to move forward. Rommel, observing reports from multiple sectors, realized the grim truth. Traditional defensive measures were failing. The Allies were not merely surviving, they were thriving, sustained by an operational force that German calculations could not match. In his private moments, he acknowledged the brilliance of the system. The Red Ball Express was more than trucks and drivers. It was a revolution in warfare logistics. Yet, admiration could not forestall the coming setbacks. His orders to fortify positions and launch counterattacks continued, but he knew the battle had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. That night, under a moonless sky, Rukard and his fellow drivers gathered around a makeshift fire. The smell of smoke mingled with the lingering tang of gasoline and mud. Men swapped stories of narrow escapes, mechanical failures, and the ever-present shadow of enemy fire. Laughter, nervous and raw, punctuated the conversation. They spoke not of glory or medals, but of survival, of the cargo that would reach the men at the front, and of the strange camaraderie forged in the belly of the supply operation. Here, in these quiet moments, the human element of logistics was laid bare. Courage, endurance, and the determination to persist against impossible odds. By dawn of the third day, the Red Ball Express had completed the delivery of nearly 5 million tons of supplies. Tanks rumbled forward, infantry pressed the attack, and artillery continued to pound German positions with unrelenting force. The operation's success was not the product of chance, but of meticulous planning, industrial capacity, and the unwavering commitment of thousands of men like Rukard, whose heroism lay not in battlefields marked by blood and fire, but in the quiet triumph of persistence, reliability, and skill. The Germans faced the inexorable truth. The Allies' supply lines were unbreakable. Every attempt at disruption failed. Every calculation had been rendered obsolete by a force that combined speed, precision, and human endurance. Rommel and his generals could only watch as the Allies' logistical mastery translated directly into operational dominance, reshaping the battlefield in ways they had never imagined. As the first light of day broke over Normandy, James Rocard once again climbed into his truck. The roads were long, the miles ahead uncertain, but he felt a quiet satisfaction. He was part of something larger than himself, an invisible army whose power lay in persistence, coordination, and courage. The Red Ball Express had proven that victory was not only fought with guns, it was earned through endurance, determination, and the unwavering drive to move forward, mile after mile, barrel after barrel, day after day. The morning mist hung low over Normandy, clinging to the fields like a ghostly shroud. James Rocard sat behind the wheel of his GMC, the engine humming steadily beneath him. The roads ahead were scarred by craters, overturned vehicles, and the remnants of skirmishes from the night before. Each mile carried the weight of necessity. Every barrel of fuel in his truck represented a lifeline for soldiers at the front, a force multiplying the Allies' operational reach. Rumors of German counterattacks had reached the depot, whispered among the drivers with tension beneath the surface. Ambushes had become more frequent, and the enemy had learned to exploit the terrain. Wooded sections, narrow bridges, and damaged roads were now potential traps. The men spoke in low voices of convoys that had been cut off, of trucks destroyed, and of comrades lost. Yet the fear never halted the movement. It only sharpened resolve. Rocard navigated a treacherous stretch of road lined with trees blackened by shell fire. The tires of his truck rattled against loose stones and hidden craters. Up ahead, a destroyed German armored vehicle blocked part of the lane. With careful precision, he maneuvered around the wreckage, instinct honed by weeks of driving under fire. The weight of his cargo pressed down on him. Yet he felt a strange sense of calm. He had done this 100 times, and each time, the rhythm of the road, the hum of the engine, and the certainty of the plan gave him strength. Meanwhile, farther inland, American tank crews felt the effects of the Red Ball Express with tangible immediacy. Lieutenant Thomas Harding's unit was advancing along a German-held ridge, the path made possible only by the timely delivery of fuel and ammunition. The tanks rumbled over cratered earth, their gunners scanning the horizon for signs of resistance. Every shell fired, every maneuver executed, was made possible by the invisible army of drivers who transported life through danger. Harding's men knew that, without these deliveries, their advance would have stalled, leaving them vulnerable to German counterattacks. In Berlin, Hitler's frustration boiled over. Reports of the Red Ball Express came in hourly, detailing successes that could not be reversed. The Führer demanded aggressive action, calling for concentrated attacks on supply lines and depots. But Rommel, seasoned and pragmatic, knew the realities on the ground. German forces lacked the mobility, the intelligence, and the coordination to disrupt the Allies' relentless logistics. Orders to attack the convoys were executed with limited success. Trucks were destroyed here and there, but the network adapted immediately. Alternate routes, pre-positioned mechanics, and disciplined drivers ensured the flow continued almost without interruption. Rocard encountered his first real danger of the day near a narrow bridge over a flooded river. German machine gunners had positioned themselves on the opposite bank, concealed in the ruined houses that overlooked the road. As his truck approached, bullets pinged against the metal sides. He ducked instinctively, the adrenaline igniting every nerve. He radioed a warning to the following convoy, swearing under his breath as he swerved to avoid debris deliberately placed to slow the trucks. The GMC groaned under the strain, but remained intact. He pressed the accelerator, praying the engine would hold, knowing that hesitation could cost lives further down the line. The attack was over almost as quickly as it began, the gunners retreating as Allied artillery suppressed their positions. Rocard exhaled, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. Had survived another attempt, but the danger was ever present, relentless and random. Across the landscape, Other drivers faced similar trials, burned-out vehicles, roadblocks, and ambushes that tested skill, nerve, and luck. The Red Ball Express was more than a logistical system. It was a gauntlet, a crucible where courage and resilience were forged. Even as the convoys pressed forward, the human cost of war remained palpable. Rukard passed a field where German prisoners had been taken, their faces hollow with fear, exhaustion, and resignation. He saw in them reflections of his own fatigue, the same longing for survival, the same small hopes amidst chaos. He recognized that war was not simply a contest of strategy or firepower, but a crucible of humanity itself, where courage and vulnerability coexisted on a knife's edge. By midday, the Red Ball Express had reached the front lines, and Harding's tanks were resupplied once more. The forward infantry moved with renewed vigor, knowing that the lifeblood of fuel and ammunition flowed steadily behind them. Engineers repaired roads and bridges, mechanics serviced trucks that had been battered by ambushes, and drivers prepared for their return trips, hauling empty barrels to be refilled and sent again. The system functioned as a single organism, adaptive, resilient, and unstoppable. Rommel, observing the unfolding operation, realized the stark truth: Germany could not break the Allied supply chain. Every tactic, every ambush, and every deployment was countered with precision, speed, and ingenuity. The Red Ball Express had redefined the operational landscape. Logistics were no longer a supporting element. They were the spearhead. The Germans faced a force that could move faster than they could react, strike with greater intensity than they could resist, and sustain the pressure indefinitely. As dusk fell, Rukard returned to a makeshift depot, exhausted but unbroken. The firelight danced across his face, highlighting the grime, sweat, and determination etched into his features. Around him, fellow drivers and mechanics shared quiet camaraderie, each man knowing that their efforts were as crucial as any victory won on the battlefield. Stories of narrow escapes, mechanical triumphs, and fleeting humor passed between them, a testament to human resilience in the face of relentless danger. The night was punctuated by distant artillery, signaling that the front continued to shift, that the war raged on with its unyielding momentum. Yet, within the confines of the depot, there was a fragile sense of accomplishment. The supplies had reached their destination, lives had been sustained, and the advance continued. The Red Ball Express had proven its worth, not through spectacle, but through persistence, coordination, and the quiet heroism of thousands of men performing ordinary acts under extraordinary circumstances. In the aftermath, the Allied command recognized the system's impact. Reports described the flow of 5 million tons of supplies, the continuous movement of trucks over hundreds of miles, and the strategic advantage it conferred. Each convoy had been a lifeline, each delivery a force multiplier, and each driver a silent guardian of victory. The operation's success had turned the tide of engagement, allowing the Allies to maintain pressure, exploit weaknesses, and sustain advances that would have been impossible without the logistical backbone. Rukard, weary and contemplative, gazed at the road ahead. He thought of the soldiers receiving the fuel and ammunition, the engineers repairing the tracks, the men who had fallen along the way, and the relentless machine of war that required such sacrifices. He understood that the story of the Red Ball Express was not one of glamour or glory, but of endurance, courage, and the profound impact of ordinary men performing extraordinary acts under unimaginable stress. The war would continue, the battlefields would shift, and the dangers would multiply. Yet, the Red Ball Express had become a symbol of human tenacity, a testament to the power of coordination, skill, and unwavering resolve. James Rukard and his comrades had driven through chaos, fear, and destruction, delivering not just supplies, but hope, sustaining an army and enabling victories that reshaped the course of history. As the final light faded over Normandy, Rukard climbed into his truck once more. The hum of the engine was a familiar companion. The road stretched endlessly before him, and the weight of responsibility pressed upon his shoulders. Yet, beneath the exhaustion, lay a quiet certainty. As long as the drivers of the Red Ball Express continued their relentless journey, as long as the wheels turned and the cargo flowed, the Advance would not falter. The story of their courage, endurance, and skill would remain unsung in many ways, hidden behind the victories on the front lines. But for those who understood the true machinery of war, the Red Ball Express stood as a monument, not of monuments, medals, or ceremonies, but of perseverance, human spirit, and the quiet triumph of relentless, unwavering action in the face of impossible odds. And so, under the darkening sky, James Rucard pressed forward. The night embraced him. The truck carried him across scarred fields and shattered roads, and the legacy of the Red Ball Express continued mile after mile, barrel after barrel, in a symphony of endurance that would echo long after the guns fell silent. The first light of dawn crept over the scarred Normandy landscape, painting the ruins in cold gold. James Rucard sat in his truck, knuckles white around the wheel, feeling the night's terrors linger. Ambushes, mines, and the echoing screams of comrades haunted him. Behind the cab, other trucks rumbled to life, engines growling as mechanics pounded on engines, patched tires, and smeared oil over bullet holes. Every truck was a lifeline. Every delay could mean death for soldiers waiting at the front. The convoy moved as one through villages reduced to skeletal frames, each mile a monument to destruction. The roads were treacherous, riddled with craters and debris. As they reached a ruined bridge, a mine detonated, hurling wood and metal into the air. Rucard swerved, narrowly avoiding the blast, while trucks behind him skidded to a halt. Dust and smoke filled the air, but the men moved instinctively. With blistered hands, they created a makeshift path, lifting, pushing, and shouting over the roar of engines. The Red Ball Express demanded adaptability. It demanded courage. Every second waited with life or death. Farther along, Lieutenant Thomas Harding's tank unit waited. Engines idled nervously as the convoy approached. Tanks and infantry depended entirely on the truck's fuel and ammunition. The convoy's arrival was more than relief. It was survival. Soldiers braced themselves, knowing the line between victory and defeat ran through every barrel delivered. At a ruined farmhouse, Rucard found German civilians huddled in fear. Children clutched their mothers, eyes wide with confusion. Soldiers offered water and food, awkward gestures in a war that had turned them into reluctant guardians. Rucard felt the weight of responsibility beyond mechanics and fuel. Each barrel, each mile was more than logistics. It preserved humanity amid destruction. The day stretched on, fatigue gnawing at every driver. Rucard's eyes burned from smoke and dust, his muscles stiff from hours behind the wheel. The landscape was a tapestry of ruin, each curve of the road a hazard, each shadow a threat. Then, distant shapes emerged, German observation posts. Rucard adjusted his path, weaving through shattered trees as bullets pinged against the truck. Behind him, the convoy tightened formation. Fear was constant, but it drove them forward, sharpened instincts, and welded them into a single entity. In Berlin, Hitler's fury mounted. Reports of convoys slipping past every interception attempt drove him to desperation. Elite divisions failed again and again. The Allies' supply machine was too adaptable, too swift. The Red Ball Express was not just transportation, it was defiance, moving history forward one truck at a time. Night descended, yet the work persisted. Headlights dimmed to avoid detection, engines idling in silent coordination. Gunfire erupted ahead in a narrow pass, shadows danced on ruined walls. Rucard pressed forward without hesitation, trusting the truck, the road, and the men behind him. Some trucks were not so fortunate. Explosions tore through darkness, fires painting grotesque shadows. Rucard looked away, concentrating on life, not destruction. Every mile delivered preserved hope, lives, and the fragile balance of survival. Rest stops were brief, but moments of reflection appeared between the relentless motion. Drivers shared cigarettes, murmured stories of close calls, or remained silent with exhaustion etched deep in their faces. The war had aged them, but their eyes held an unbroken resolve. Letters from home arrived sporadically, fragile lifelines of normalcy. Rucard read one from his sister, words of longing urging him to stay alive. He let himself feel that fleeting warmth before returning to duty, aware that every mile mattered. By morning, the convoy reached a critical crossroad where multiple routes converged. Engineers had built makeshift bridges over bombed-out sections, and guards ensured German reconnaissance could not sabotage the effort. Rucard's truck crawled over the creaking beams. Each careful turn was proof of ingenuity, coordination, and courage. The Red Ball Express was not just supply. It was the beating heart of the Allied advance. As the day wore on, the toll of continuous operations became visible. Drivers leaned against trucks, mechanics rubbed sore arms, and fatigue slowed every motion. Yet the convoy persisted, driven by hunger, fear, camaraderie, and the knowledge that soldiers' lives hung on each barrel delivered. At a crossroads village, retreating German troops passed by, faces etched with confusion and weariness. Rucard glimpsed a reflection of what he and his men might have looked like under different circumstances. War was absurd in its cycles of pursuit and retreat, but there was no time for reflection. Duty pressed forward relentlessly. Mid-afternoon brought a sudden storm, hammering rain against metal trucks, turning roads into mud-choked traps. Visibility dropped to yards. Engines roared through the muck as Rucard guided the convoy. A truck skidded off the road, tipping dangerously. Men leaped into the rain, securing the vehicle and driver. Moments like these defined the Red Ball Express: unity under peril, courage under impossible conditions, humanity persisting amid chaos. Night fell again, punctuated by distant artillery and relentless rain. Exhaustion pressed on every shoulder, but Rucard's focus never wavered. Ahead, smoke rose from the battlefield. Around him, destroyed villages whispered silent warnings. He thought of soldiers awaiting fuel, of lives dependent on every mile. This was endurance, perseverance, and the quiet heroism of men performing extraordinary acts without fanfare or recognition. By dawn, the convoy reached a forward supply point. Soldiers scrambled to unload barrels, refuel tanks, and distribute ammunition. Success was evident, but so was cost, exhaustion, injuries, and the silent grief of lost comrades. Victory was measured in duty fulfilled, in lives sustained, in missions completed under relentless adversity. Rucard walked among the trucks, inspecting for damage, ensuring readiness for the return journey. The Red Ball Express was indispensable, more than a convoy, an artery of survival flowing through war-torn France. Smoke from distant battles mingled with diesel and rain, casting the countryside in shades of grey and gold. He felt profound respect for the men around him, for ingenuity, determination, and courage that defied destruction. The storm had passed, roads slick but navigable, engines roared to life, and the convoy prepared for the journey home. Exhaustion weighed heavily, yet resilience drove them forward. The Red Ball Express was a symbol, a lifeline, a statement that human effort could bend the course of war. Rucard climbed into his cab as night fell, headlights piercing the darkness. Each mile was a testament, each turn a reaffirmation of resolve. The hum of the engine seemed alive, a companion through endless danger. Tire tracks marked the landscape like veins, carrying fuel, ammunition, and above all, courage. Even as first light approached, the men knew tomorrow would bring the same challenges, the same danger. Yet, each mile delivered, each convoy completed, was proof that endurance could shape history. The Red Ball Express was relentless, flowing through France with the strength of men who refused to yield, who understood that perseverance in the darkest hours could save lives, sustain hope, and alter the fate of nations. James Rucard pressed forward, the road stretching endlessly before him. Engines roared, rain gleamed on mud-caked metal, and the wind carried the scent of gunfire and distant victory. Every mile, every barrel, every act of courage was a thread in the tapestry of survival. The Red Ball Express would not stop. It could not. It was more than trucks and fuel. It was humanity moving against despair, a lifeline woven from steel, sweat, and unwavering determination. Through ruined villages, across shattered bridges, and under a sky darkened by smoke and storm, the convoy moved. Men worked in unison, facing bullets, mud, and exhaustion, with the same relentless resolve that had carried them across every mile of France. Each delivery sustained soldiers who would fight, survive, and remember. Each mile was a story, each convoy a testament. By the time dawn broke fully, Rukard saw the convoy's reflection in a rain-soaked puddle. Faces were grim, eyes lined with fatigue, yet none wavered. They had moved mountains of supplies, defied ambushes, and continued through fear and storm. The Red Ball Express was immortal, not in steel or trucks, but in the courage of those who drove it, who maintained it, who refused to surrender to chaos. Rukard's mind wandered briefly to home, to letters, to the small comforts of ordinary life. Yet the road demanded focus, and he obeyed. Each mile carried life, each truck carried hope, and the war advanced only because men like him refused to let it falter. Exhaustion would not break them. Fear would not halt them. Their endurance was the lifeblood of the front, the hidden engine of victory. As the convoy pressed on, the sun rose fully over Normandy, illuminating destruction and resilience alike. Smoke, mud, and ruin mixed with the golden light, revealing the cost of war and the courage required to endure it. Rukard's truck moved steadily, the engine humming like a heartbeat. Around him, the convoy flowed as one, a river of men, trucks, and resolve, cutting through chaos. The day would be long, filled with hazards and hardship. Yet each mile completed was a triumph. Each mile sustained soldiers, preserved hope, and demonstrated the extraordinary power of human endurance. Rukard gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the strength of purpose. The Red Ball Express was unstoppable because it carried more than fuel. It carried the spirit of men who refused to give in, who refused to stop, who understood that even amid devastation, perseverance could triumph. The convoy continued, unstoppable, across Normandy, carrying with it the courage, skill, and endurance of men bound by duty, humanity, and unbreakable resolve. Each mile, each barrel, each heartbeat was a testament to the extraordinary power of ordinary men. The Red Ball Express moved on, relentless and unyielding, shaping history, nay, in a one-tire track, one delivery, one act of courage at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.